Good morning, New Ground. Pastor Mike here. Uh, Finally, following up on some questions from the last couple, 2 or 3 weeks, and I apologize that that didn't happen before, but I've been sick for the last week and a half, so and I've been trying to catch up ever since. So, finally getting around to these questions, and there are some really good ones, so I wanted to make sure I took some time to kind of think through them a little bit before I responded. So I am going to go through a blitz of questions today on the last 3 weeks of teachings, including, as we've been walking through the series on the Ten Commandments, including murder and adultery and stealing. So, a few questions. Most of them are on the murder, so I know people have been waiting to hear that. So we want to make sure that we kind of give it justice a little bit. I mean, the thing is, these questions are so big. It almost feels like it's a good small group discussion time, actually, come to think of it. But I'll try my best to respond to these, and we'll kind of go from there. So on murder, there's one, two, I think there's 3 or 4 questions if I remember correctly. The first question is this: what about the sixth commandment dealing with murder and abortion? Of course, guns all blazing, come out swinging, right? On these questions, I kind of you knew these questions would come up, and so here's what I want to encourage you. First of all, it's a very complex topic, and that's what you have to admit at first, especially with a lot of these things that are especially politically charged in our day, where that I think that has hijacked a lot of the conversation. But what the beauty is of our denomination is, and if you haven't visited, I would highly encourage you to do so. RCA.org. If you go there, they actually have a section on contemporary topics, on all sorts of things. And when you read it, first of all, I just want to encourage you to say, if there's a position that our denomination has taken that you don't agree with, it doesn't mean you can't be a part of our church at all. Because we have a diversity of people in our community who have a diversity of opinion, and even on this particular topic, for that matter. But I always find it helpful to know exactly what the denomination has done, and I think, one of the reasons I appreciate the RCA and being a part of it is I think they really do think through well in community these topics and all its complexities. And so I think that dialogue happens. And what's really interesting is when you talk about abortion specifically, which is on there, what the RCA does is with these contemporary topics, they actually chronicle the history of what the discussion has been in the General Synod level, which is our kind of big gathering that we have annually in June, and statements they've made and those kinds of things. And so I would just encourage you to go there. It's really, really good. But I wanted to read to you what they have said about abortion, and it's not like the end-all, but what's really fascinating to me is that this was written in 1973, which makes you think, well, it's a little dated for the discussion. No, not really. But just listen to what they said in part of the statement from the General Synod from 1973. It says, "We believe the Bible teaches the sanctity of human life." Excuse me. "We are given the precious gift of life from God and are created in the image of God. Therefore, we believe in principle that abortion ought not to be practiced at all. However, in this complex society where many times one form of evil is pitted against another form of evil, there could be exceptions. It is our Christian conviction that abortion performed for personal reasons to ensure individual convenience ought not to be permitted." And then they say, "We call on all who counsel those with problem pregnancies, especially youth workers, campus pastors, and staff members of our church colleges to uphold the Christian alternatives to abortion. We call on churches to expand their efforts to support agencies providing a ministry of mercy to those seeking alternatives to abortion. We call on our members to support efforts for constitutional changes to provide legal protection for the unborn." 1973 is when they stated that. But what's interesting as you kind of go throughout just even that page is, the Synod, as they continue to have this discussion, acknowledge the complexities of what those exceptions are that they mentioned in 1973. And that's what I love, is to say, look, don't just treat this as a black and white issue. There are situations, and they even say this later on, I believe, in 1990, the Commission on Christian Action said this: "One way for the church to respond to the tragedy is to address those forces to which women are especially vulnerable: poverty, a lack of support services, the demands of the workplace upon the family. Women should not be forced to choose between living in poverty or giving birth, between caring for their newborn or losing their job. They should not feel pressure to abort an unborn child because they have nowhere to turn to support. And it acknowledges the complexities of systems that are in place that make women have to have those choices. All this aside, to try to tackle this in a 15-minute video about a lot of other questions is not going to do it justice. But I would just encourage you to continue to have those discussions. I have friends who have had abortions, and I've had friends who have decided not to have abortions, and the stories of all of those friends are extremely complex and nuanced, and it takes a humble listening ear to walk well, because there's so much pain involved in any of those decisions. That's why it's so important to do that with grace. The other thing is on the website, they also have it's a pretty long guide, but decent. I mean, it's from 1996, but a 52-page discussion guide on having those more complex conversations. So if that's something that interests you, I would just head over there and check that out. It's really good. So let's move on. What about murdering murderers? You said killing in war is allowed, so where do we sit on that boundary? The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, what was clear to the Jewish people is that there was an allowance for of killing in war. Like, it wasn't something that was considered a capital offense in the Torah. However, as time has went along, as things have evolved, and especially as people kind of contemplate the teachings of Jesus, the one text that people like to mention is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and Jesus kind of challenged that a little bit. I'll say a little bit, a lot. And so there's been a lot of discussion and debate about, well, what is the view of capital punishment and how does that work? And again, just like I do with abortion, you always have to treat it with humility and understanding that there's a lot of personal passions upon why people do that. In fact, I know I'm working on a series for after Easter to talk about dialogue and talk about I'm calling it Can We Talk, to talk through how do we talk about these things and where do we even start. And so I think one of those things is learning how to talk to one another, first of all, and part of that is do you seek to understand other people's stories? Because there's always a story behind a conviction that someone has about an issue. And so I would encourage you that way when you kind of talk through that with any of these things, that you have that posture. Again, referring to our denomination, the RCA, they also have a statement about capital punishment, and where they stand is that our denomination said we don't support capital punishment as a valid form of punishment for crimes. And so, and I'm not going to get into too much of why that is. Again, you can choose to disagree with that, and it doesn't mean you can't be a part of our church or the denomination or whatever. It doesn't mean that at all, in fact. And but it's just something that there's a great discussion there with that. Personally, I am not a person that believes in that as well. I'm not a supporter of it, but that doesn't mean it's not something worth discussing. And again, it's just acknowledging the complexity of the issue is really important in having those discussions. And who do you know? One of the things that people talk, even with this, and even talking about war, for example, my family has a huge history of military service, and so one of the things, and I've heard the stories from my father and grandfather about just the realities and complexities of war and how just unconscionably hard it is and difficult. And so I have a tremendous amount of respect and humility toward that conversation in light of that. And so anyway, for what it's worth, I mean, I'm sure that it's a great continued point of discussion with that. So hopefully that gives a little bit of insight. Next question. What does the Bible say about eating meat, hunting, killing animals, also eye for an eye, death penalty, which I kind of addressed already? One of the things to acknowledge is that, and I'm going to move this because I keep bouncing it on my lap here. One of the things that is important to understand, culturally, is, we didn't have a culture where we had to hunt for our food to survive, right? That's That's kind of the culture that the people of the Bible found themselves in. And so we don't have that kind of pressure. Well, I'll say our particular country and culture doesn't have that particular pressure. And so the question is much different, where there's hunting for sport, and that's where kind of the debate, comes in with that. But that said, here's an argument for, some people argue for, should we all be vegetarians? We shouldn't hunt at all? What about animal rights? Those kinds of things. One of the here's the argument that some use for not eating meat. They'll go to they'll say I'll say they, because I don't know where I related this, but I eat meat. So Genesis 2:16 and 17, it says this, that you may Lord God commanded the man, saying, you may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in that day that you eat of it you shall surely die. And so the argument there is God didn't tell them to eat the animals, only to eat from the trees. And so people use that to say, hey, that's a commandment that, before the fall even happened, to not eat meat. And then further on in Genesis chapter 9, after Noah and the flood, God tells Noah, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And there's a whole teaching of why that matters for the why the blood's important. But regardless of that, it's an argument that some use. That's us telling God telling us not to eat even red meat, right? Meat with blood. So there's all sorts of discussion and again, I don't think it's necessarily an essential. What the argument could be is, it's not like a capital sin like murder is. I mean, what murder was talking about was the murder of another human being, someone made in the image of God. Animals are not. So that's kind of part of the argument. But also, the thrust may be maybe vegetarianism is the ideal, and eating meat isn't something that you're gonna be held accountable to per se, but it isn't God's ideal for us. That could be possible. In fact, there's many friends who are vegetarians, friends of mine, family members who do that, who talk about the extreme benefits of being a vegetarian. And less meat in our lives, I think, is better, especially with all the kind of hormones that get pumped into stuff today. But regardless of that, I'm still having a hard time. I do like my meat, and so it's something that I definitely think about, but I don't think it's a hill to die on, if you will. But there is arguments there. Again, all these discussions are complex, but as far as the Torah is concerned, it is not specifically talking about animals, and this is talking about the taking of another human life. Last question on this: what about the behavior of another, a president? I won't comment about the president. I don't want to get into that. I would try to lead with. I think this question stemmed from the idea about murder, not just the physical act of murder, but what murder is at its core, which is standing above another person in judgment of their worth and those kinds of things. And I think one of the things you just got to take seriously is that lashing out in anger at someone to make judgments about their worth is a serious thing. It's something that really destroys people's lives. As little as you may think it does, it does. When you've experienced that, you know how that is. So I would say, I'm not going to comment on the president. I mean, I don't know what you're trying to get me to do, but regardless of that, I think the first place to start always with any of these discussions is with you. To ask questions about, what am I doing to participate in this type of way of life? And what do I need to confess? What do I need to turn away from and live differently? That's where you always should start. Instead of trying to blame others all the time, to turn the other way and say, hey, how am I participating in this, and how can I live differently, for what it's worth? There's 2 more questions I think I'll try to tackle, and I know it's been about 15 minutes, but we'll go for it. Moving on to adultery, I had one question, which was, how do we restore the viewpoint of humanity in a world where broken people can even crave objectification just to feel recognized or valued? Great question. It almost feels like that. It seems like it's so overwhelming of our particular culture in the United States, really pressing and promoting objectification of people. and it's not just women; it's both men and women. But women's a big one. And again, like with the previous question, I think the one thing you have to start with is where do you start? One of the things, it's like we live in a broken world. It's so overwhelming. How do we overcome this? The church is called to be the type of community that lives a different way, that lives the way of Jesus, which is the best way to live. I mean, in my opinion. And so, part of the church's call is to model what this looks like, to live a life of redemption, of reconciliation, a way that does not cave to the ways of objectifying people, of treating people as a possession for you to gain pleasure from. And so what does it look like for the church to do that? That said, because our culture is so pressured into doing that, I mean, the one thing I would encourage is you have to have someone to keep you accountable, right? You have to have people in your lives who are willing to ask you the hard questions. You have to have people in your life who are willing to give you grace when you fail. You have to have people in your lives who encourage you when you're living the way of Jesus, to continue to spur you on into love and good deeds, as the scripture says. And so that's where it starts, because you can't do this by yourself. Especially with the pressures of the culture that make objectification not only the norm, but a $1 billion enterprise, right? So what are you doing to participate in that? Number one, identifying that, and then who do you have in your life to help to walk with you in the midst of that and do that together? That would be my encouragement in that way. And on stealing from last week, which Reverend Emmett Brown did a wonderful job of talking through, especially the ways we steal, the intangible ways we steal, not just the physical ways. How do you guard against entering the cycle of spiritual and personal theft is the question. And again, I would say the same thing as adultery. Examine yourself. Reverend Emmett talked about all the ways we do that in the intangible ways. And if you didn't listen to that teaching, go back and listen to it first, and then kind of think through these questions of what do I do to participate with that? I mean, with all of these commandments and all this way of life that God has called us through in Jesus, you have to have people to walk with you. You have to have a community of people who are willing to walk with you in these things. And that's, it seems so basic, and for those of you who've been in church a while, it seems like, that we've heard that before, but isn't it true? I mean, don't you need others to spur you on? You need others to pick you up when you fall. And it's like, well, pick yourself up. Sure, you could try, but we really need other people to do that with us. And I think as we continue to journey together as a church, we need to continue to ask our questions of what does it look like to walk as the church in a way that God wants us to live. And sometimes that might be counter to our culture. Sometimes that might be celebrating something in our culture that's good. But the church is supposed to be the group of people who model what it looks like for God's redemption, for the good news to be embodied in the world. We're called to do that. And so with all these things, it's all God telling us there's a certain way I want you to live, and it's a blessing to humanity. It will help you flourish in the best way possible. Anyway, well, hey, thanks for listening. If you listen this long, good for you. I tried to cram 3 weeks into 20 minutes as much as I possibly could. Looking forward to Sunday as we continue our series on the 10 words, talking about witness. Also, if you weren't with us last week, we had Maddie Phillips with us, who's going to Nicaragua. We commissioned her in that service, and she's also raising support as well. And so if you're interested in that, send us a response at info@newgroundchurch.org, or come on Sunday. We're taking in donations for support for her as well. She's leaving on the 19th of February, I believe, so we're trying to get her some support financially before that. You could obviously always pray for her in this amazing journey that she's on. And so hope to see you on Sunday at 10 a.m. We look forward to seeing you. Grace and peace in the meantime.